Well, good evening. Thanks very much for inviting me. You may find that I'm overlapping a little bit with what Emily had to say, but forgive me, I'm also feeling a little bit of trepidation with Senator Miller in the audience, who obviously knows a lot more than I do about the state budget, having been on the Senate Finance Committee, and so I hope you'll correct me when I say things that clearly aren't as knowledgeable as you would say. As Emily mentioned, my organization, Policy Matters Ohio, is based here in Cleveland. We have a couple of people in Columbus as well, and we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute. We do work on state-level policy issues, some others as well, but again, from the standpoint of lower and middle-income Ohioans, we do work on everything from education, unemployment insurance, energy, and of course the state budget. So I wanted to talk especially about the tax side for a few minutes and a couple of local issues, and then maybe we can all take questions. Emily's mentioned how we're receiving less tax revenue, and obviously a great deal of that is because of the national economic downturn where fewer people are working, fewer people are buying as much, and so the income and the sales tax are primary taxes in Ohio, and most states are not bringing in the same amount of revenue that they did 3-4 years ago, even if they've leveled out and are maybe increasing very slightly. What's less known is that a very large chunk of the $8 billion or so deficit that people believe we face is in fact self-inflicted. In 2005, Ohio, the General Assembly approved the biggest tax reform that the state had seen in a generation since the creation of the income tax in the early 70s. And that tax reform, according to the Ohio Department of Taxation, reduced the amount of tax revenue that the state received in the last fiscal year by over $2 billion. Why is that? Well, many of you are probably familiar with it, but to go over it very briefly, at least the biggest elements, we saw the income tax reduced by 21%. Of course, the last and final year of the 5 years of that was delayed, so we only saw 16%, but still a considerable amount. We saw the elimination of the tangible personal property tax, which had been bringing in about $1.6 billion a year to localities and to schools. We saw the elimination of the corporate franchise tax, which, while it hadn't been bringing in that amount at the time, was estimated to be bringing in about that same amount, $1.6 billion, had it continued. And the new commercial activity tax, which is levied on gross receipts or sales, I guess I should say, although legally speaking it is not a sales tax, and the state would be very quick to, the tax department, I was just talking with someone there this afternoon, and he was quick to remind me that that was the case, because it has major legal implications. But anyway, the CAT tax was supposed to bring in about $1.6 billion. In other words, about half of the two business taxes that it was supposed to replace. Now, as Emily has mentioned, it's bringing in even less than that projected amount. So we have that additional deficit. But even if it were bringing in as much as it was supposed to, we would be missing $1.5 billion of business tax revenue that previously was paid. So when you ask, why does the state have the reduced tax revenue, it's a very significant element of it is the, in fact, policy decisions that we made to cut taxes in 2005. Now, how was that possible? How could we have gotten along all this time? Well, the way that that was possible is that in 2005, the General Assembly raised certain other taxes, and it did that quickly and immediately. So you saw the sales tax, I guess you could call it depends on how you look at it, but at least as a matter of law, that was 5.5%. We saw the cigarette tax increased. We saw a reduction in the rollback that commercial industrial property had on the real property tax. So there was additional revenue generated in the first couple of years, so nobody was really all that concerned about it because it didn't really show up in a big way. And so it was only in the last couple of years as the reductions, which were all phased in, became more substantial that this became more of a problem. But I think that this is a major element in our fiscal situation, and to act as if this is entirely a matter of the economy or that we simply don't have all the federal stimulus money, while those are in fact important reasons that shouldn't be ignored, we also have our own policy that is a major factor here. Now, the question you would have is, well, okay, has it worked? I mean, there was a policy decision made that this made sense to reduce these taxes because it would generate economic growth, economic success. Well, we all know we're in a national recession. We can't expect that Ohio would somehow be doing so much better than all the rest of the country. That would be unrealistic. It would be realistic, however, to think that at least relatively speaking, we would have improved somewhat compared to everyone else. If everyone else was going down, we would go down a little bit less. Well, I think you don't need a researcher like myself to tell you that that's not what's happened, that Ohio has not gained ground during this period. It didn't gain ground before the recession began in 2005, 2006, early 2007, and it hasn't done so since then. Now, there was a bit of an improvement earlier this year when the manufacturing economy and the auto industry in particular improved somewhat because we have those obviously as major industries here. But I think that it would be very difficult to argue in a strong way that the tax cuts that we saw in 2005 have in fact produced the economic gains that were sought after. And so to our view, what we've seen is a loss in very significant revenue without economic growth that you would have hoped for. Now, in a way, I don't think that that's too surprising. I think that if you look at the most recent unemployment rates, I think that that gives you a good sense for why it is that we shouldn't have expected that these kinds of tax cuts would have generated great growth. You look at the two states that have the lowest unemployment rates in the country right now, and what are they? Well, they're North Dakota and South Dakota. North Dakota has the 5th highest taxes of any state in the country, has an income tax. South Dakota has the lowest taxes of any state in the country and no income tax. Yet they have the 2 lowest unemployment rates in the country. Well, why is that? I would submit that it's because they're the Dakotas, and that there's something that the Dakotas are similar about, that they have similar resources, similar economies, and that while, yes, they have different tax structures, that has some impact, it's very much subsidiary to these other issues, and that explains why we shouldn't expect that having a cut in taxes would have some gigantic impact on our economy. Some states with high taxes have better economies. Some states with low taxes have better economies. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, in fact, did a study, and they looked at the state economic growth over a 50-year period, and they discovered that taxes were not actually a significant factor in which states had the greatest growth over that period. So, okay, enough on taxes for a moment, but I think that that needs to be considered when you look at what the solutions are and you look at why we have this problem. This is not just a matter of the economy.